Rain hammered the thin tin roof of the small dojo, a rhythmic drum that echoed the turmoil inside Takashi's chest. He stood motionless, arms folded across his chest, watching the water trace chaotic paths down the dusty wooden floor. Outside, the world seemed to collapse under the storm, but inside, the storm was him, silent, bitter, relentless. Takashi had once been a promising athlete, the kind of young man whose presence drew eyes in a crowded room, whose laughter had once lit up every corner of his childhood home. But that was before everything cracked. His father had passed when Takashi was 19, leaving behind a silent house and a mountain of unspoken expectations. His mother had withdrawn into herself, her love now a quiet shadow, felt more in absence than presence. Takashi had tried to fill the void with ambition, but failure had become a constant companion, whispering that he was never enough. That morning, as he stared into the reflection of his tired eyes in the dojo mirror, he remembered the words of an old mentor. Discipline is not punishment. It is the path through the storm. Only when the storm becomes part of you, can you truly move without fear. He didn't know if he could believe it. He hadn't felt control in years, not since the accident that had ended his career. A single misstep, a fleeting distraction, and everything he loved had been ripped from him. He had watched dreams crumble, relationships fade, and he had watched himself fade. Now, at 28, Takashi's life was a quiet battlefield. Each day blurred into the next, and even the simplest tasks felt like climbing invisible walls. He knew he needed a change, something profound, something that could reshape not only his body but the very essence of who he had become. And that's when he found the Ninpo System. He had heard whispers of it in an obscure forum, stories of warriors who had rebuilt themselves from despair into strength in just 100 days. Ninpo wasn't merely martial art, it was a philosophy, a method that demanded absolute honesty, resilience, and discipline. It was said to strip away weakness, fear, and hesitation, leaving only clarity and purpose. Takashi's first day was humbling. The dojo was empty, silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams and the rain outside. The first exercise was deceptively simple: sit, breathe, and listen, to the body, to the mind, to the world. Yet every second brought waves of frustration. His muscles trembled, his thoughts screamed, and memories he had long buried rose like ghosts from the depths of his mind. The Ninpo System did not excuse weakness. It confronted it. Every failure was immediate, visible, undeniable. He fell, stumbled, and rose again, over and over. The mirror reflected his progress, but also his pain, the tight lines around his eyes, the hollow look in his cheeks, the anger simmering beneath every movement. But then, something subtle began to shift. During a late-night session, as the rain softened to a drizzle, Takashi closed his eyes mid-practice and heard it: silence. Not the absence of sound, but a quieting of the chaos within. The doubts, the fears, the guilt, they were still there, but they were no longer screaming. They had become something he could acknowledge without flinching. A week in, exhaustion became a companion rather than an enemy. His body ached, his mind reeled, yet there was a strange sense of exhilaration. He began to feel alive again, a sensation that had been missing for nearly a decade. Every strike, every movement, every controlled breath was a reminder: he could act. He could endure. He could fight, not against others, but against the parts of himself that had long since surrendered. But with every step forward came shadows. Memories of failure clung to him like wet clothes. Nights were the hardest, silent, lonely, filled with the echoes of lost opportunities and the faces of those he had failed. His mother's quiet disapproval, the coach's disappointed gazes, the friends who had drifted away, all haunted him, and yet he persisted. The Ninpo System demanded more than physical endurance, it demanded emotional honesty. Every day, Takashi had to confront not only the limits of his body but the truths he had avoided for years. He journaled, meditated, trained, and reflected. It was grueling. Pain became his teacher, and solitude became his mirror. Then came the turning point, a single moment that would shape the next 90 days. It was during a particularly grueling training session. His hands were raw, His muscles screamed with fatigue, and his breath came in ragged bursts. He collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving, body trembling. He expected anger, frustration, perhaps even despair. But instead, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. A spark. He realized that the Ninpo system was not a path to perfection. It was a path to truth. It stripped away excuses, illusions, and weakness. And in that truth, Takashi glimpsed the possibility of becoming more than he had ever imagined, not just a warrior in the physical sense, but a warrior of mind, spirit, and soul. He rose, slowly, deliberately, and faced the mirror. The reflection was still of a man scarred by failure, but now there was something new, a quiet determination, the faint gleam of resolve, the first traces of courage rekindled. And then, as he prepared to start the next sequence of training, the dojo door creaked open. A shadow fell across the wet wooden floor. Takashi's heart skipped. It wasn't expected. He was alone, or so he thought. The shadow moved closer. A voice, calm but edged with authority, broke the silence. "You are ready to face the real challenge." Takashi's breath caught. Ready? He didn't even know if he could survive the next hour, let alone the next 100 days. Yet something in the voice stirred something deep inside, a calling, a test, an invitation he couldn't refuse. And in that moment, with rain still falling softly outside, Takashi understood. The journey had only just begun. The storm outside mirrored the storm within, and for the first time in years, he felt that he might just endure it. But what awaited him behind that door would change everything. The figure stepped fully into the dojo, the dim light catching the glint of a polished sword strapped to his back. His presence was quiet, yet commanding, as though the room itself had shifted to accommodate him. Takashi swallowed hard. The voice, calm yet edged with authority, belonged to Master Haruto, a man whose reputation in the Ninpo system was legendary. Few had ever trained under him, and fewer had endured. "You think this is about strength," Haruto said, pacing slowly across the rain-slicked floor. "You are wrong. Strength is trivial. Discipline, focus, and clarity, these are your true opponents." Takashi nodded, though his chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to claim he was ready, that he could endure, but he knew better. Every fiber of his being still trembled with doubt. "For the next 100 days," Haruto continued, "you will not only train your body. You will confront your fears, your failures, your past. If you falter, you will not rise. If you surrender, you will remain lost." The words landed like stones in Takashi's chest. His mind raced. Memories of every failure, every accident, every lost opportunity, every harsh word, pressed against him. He had hoped to escape them, or at least bury them beneath repetition and sweat. But now, they were front and center, unavoidable. The first week with Haruto was brutal. Not physically, though the exercises were relentless, but mentally. Takashi was forced to face mirrors that reflected not only his body, but his soul. Haruto's training included meditative strikes against invisible opponents, tests of endurance where even breathing became a challenge, and lessons that forced Takashi to confront his deepest insecurities. "You hesitate," Haruto said one evening, after Takashi had stumbled in a sequence of precise movements. "Why?" Takashi clenched his fists. I don't know," he admitted. His voice was raw. I'm afraid I'll fail again." Haruto's gaze was piercing. "Then let fear be your teacher. Fear shows you where you are weak. Every man who fears has the capacity to grow. What matters is what you do next." And so Takashi pushed forward. Every morning, he rose before dawn, his muscles screaming with exhaustion. He trained through blisters, rain, and relentless mental scrutiny. He meditated until the silence of the mind became deafening, forcing thoughts he had avoided for years to surface. Each day, he felt the weight of the past pressing against him, testing whether he would crumble or endure. By the end of the second week, he felt cracks in his composure. Old regrets clawed at him. He remembered his father's disappointed gaze the day he left sports behind, his mother's whispered sighs in the empty kitchen, the laughter of friends who had abandoned him. Anger, guilt, and sorrow twisted together like a storm inside him. One night, in the solitude of the dojo, he broke. Sitting on the wet wooden floor, Takashi buried his face in his hands and let the tears come. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, hot, and unrelenting. He had thought himself strong, but here, under the unforgiving eyes of his own reflection and the distant watch of Haruto, he realized how fragile he had been. "You cannot fight the world," he whispered to himself. "If I cannot even fight myself." Haruto appeared silently behind him. Without a word, he placed a hand on Takashi's shoulder. It was steady, grounding. Takashi flinched, but did not move away. "The world will not show mercy," Haruto said softly. "But neither will you if you surrender. The Ninpo system is not about breaking you. It is about shaping you. And shapes are formed through pressure, through pain, through endurance. You are being formed now." In that moment, Takashi understood something profound. This journey was not about becoming someone new. It was about finding the parts of himself he had abandoned, the courage, the persistence, the warrior hidden beneath years of fear. The days that followed were a crucible. Haruto introduced challenges that seemed impossible. Takashi was forced to train blindfolded, strike targets in the dark, endure hours of meditation while balancing on unstable beams, and confront scenarios that tested his emotional resilience. At times he thought he would collapse, that his body and mind would give in. But each time, he forced himself to rise, and slowly, subtly, he began to notice changes. The trembling in his hands decreased. His breathing, once shallow and ragged, became deliberate and controlled. His mind, once flooded with chaotic thoughts, found moments of clarity. But the transformation was not just physical or mental, it was emotional. Takashi began to forgive himself for past mistakes. He began to understand that failures did not define him. His responses did. Yet, the journey was far from easy. Every night brought dreams that shook him, visions of his past failures, distorted and amplified, chasing him through endless corridors of regret. He would wake drenched in sweat, heart racing, but instead of fleeing, he would return to the dojo. Pain became a familiar companion, fear an old teacher, and discipline the only path forward. By the 60th day, Takashi was unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in presence. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a deliberate calm in his movements. He had learned to endure, to act without hesitation, to face discomfort without retreat. He had become a warrior, not for show, but in essence. And then came the final test, a challenge that would push him beyond physical limits, into the core of his being. Haruto led him to a cliff overlooking a stormy sea. Waves crashed against jagged rocks, wind biting through every layer of clothing. Takashi's muscles burned, lungs screamed, and fear threatened to pull him backward. "Jump!" Haruto commanded. Takashi froze. "Jump!" The wind howled in his ears. The sea below seemed endless, merciless. The old part of him, the part that had crumbled before, whispered to retreat. But the warrior he had become, the part forged through 100 days of unrelenting discipline, stood firm. He inhaled deeply, recalling every lesson, every struggle, every moment of doubt and triumph. And then, with a heart pounding like a war drum, he leapt. The wind swallowed him. The world blurred. Fear screamed. And then, he landed. Solid. Ground beneath his feet, heart steady, mind clear. He had confronted the storm and endured. Haruto's gaze softened. "You have not only survived, Takashi. You have been reborn. But remember, the journey is never truly complete. The storm will always return. What matters is that you now have the strength to stand, no matter how fierce it rages." Takashi's chest heaved, not with exhaustion, but with a profound sense of awakening. He had faced himself, endured the impossible, and emerged transformed. But as he looked out over the endless storm, a quiet thought gnawed at him, a challenge still waiting, beyond the horizon, beyond even Haruto's guidance. Something in him stirred, sensing that the true test, the one that would define his life beyond these 100 days, had yet to come. The dawn broke slowly over the horizon, casting golden light across the dojo's wooden floors. Takashi stood alone, the echo of the storm from the previous night still lingering in the air, mingling with the faint scent of rain and wet earth. The sea beyond the cliff was calm now, but the memory of its relentless fury remained, a reminder that life, like the waves, was unpredictable, unforgiving, and vast. He had completed 100 days of the Ninpo System. 100 days of relentless discipline, emotional confrontation, and physical endurance. But what truly lingered was not the exhaustion, the blisters, or the hours of meditative struggle. It was the quiet transformation that had rooted itself in the very core of his being. Takashi's hands, once trembling with fear, now rested steady at his sides. His back, once bent with the weight of regret, held an unshakable poise. But it was the subtle shift in his gaze, the depth in his eyes, that told the real story. He had met himself, faced every fracture and fault, and endured. He was no longer running from fear. He was moving through it. Haruto appeared beside him silently, as if he had always been there, a guardian of lessons rather than a teacher. "You have done well," Haruto said, voice calm yet resonant, carrying a weight of respect that few ever heard. "But remember this, Takashi, the Ninpo System does not end at 100 days. It is not a finish line. It is a mirror. Life will continue to test you, to push you to the edge. But now you have learned to see clearly, to act with purpose, to endure when all seems lost." Takashi absorbed the words, feeling their gravity. For years he had been adrift, pulled by currents of doubt, regret, and fear. But now, he understood something profound. True discipline was not about rigid routines, or endless repetition, or even victory over others. It was about mastery over oneself. The Ninpo System had taught him that. The journey back home was quiet. Takashi walked through streets still wet from the lingering rain, feeling the pulse of the city, the hum of life, yet experiencing it differently. The noises that once overwhelmed him, the horns, the chatter, the clatter of daily life, now felt distant, like background music to a symphony in which he was finally playing his part. He returned to his mother's house. She was in the kitchen, tending to tea, her eyes tired but alive. For a moment neither spoke. Then, without words, she reached for his hand. Takashi felt a warmth he had not felt in years, the silent acknowledgement that he was not lost, that he had returned, not broken, but whole. "You look different," she whispered, a faint smile tracing her lips. Takashi nodded, unable to find words. How could he explain the journey of 100 days? The countless moments of pain, the endless self-confrontation, the exhilaration of rising again after every fall. Words felt too small, too inadequate. And yet, perhaps no explanation was necessary. The transformation was visible in his presence, in the quiet strength he carried, in the steady rhythm of his heart. Over the weeks, Takashi integrated the lessons of Ninpo into daily life. He trained each morning, but the focus was no longer on the sheer endurance of the body. It was the discipline of the mind, the clarity of decision, the awareness of self and surroundings. Mistakes still happened, life was never so forgiving, but he met them without panic, without despair. He had learned that failure was not a verdict, but a teacher, and that endurance was born not in comfort, but in the storm. One evening, as the sun sank low over the horizon, Takashi stood on the same cliff where he had faced his final test. He looked out at the sea, the waves now gentle, almost tender, yet beneath their calm lay the same force that had tested him before. He smiled softly, feeling the presence of the storm without fear. He had become a warrior, not through combat alone, but through discipline, endurance, and profound self-understanding. He thought back to the first day, the hollow emptiness he had felt, the rage and grief that had threatened to consume him. He remembered the tears, the trembling hands, the nights he had doubted everything. And he realized that all of it had been necessary. The pain, the struggle, the relentless training, they were the forge in which he had been made stronger, steadier, and more alive. Takashi closed his eyes, feeling the wind against his face. The world would continue to challenge him, as it would all who dared to grow. But he knew now that discipline was not a punishment, it was freedom. Freedom from fear, from doubt, from the chains of past failures. It was the power to stand, Even when the storm raged, to act with clarity, to endure, and to rise again. Always. A single thought lingered, simple yet profound. Life was not about avoiding storms, it was about learning to stand in them. And Takashi, forged through 100 days of the Ninpo system, had finally learned how. He opened his eyes, steady, calm, resolute. The horizon stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of possibility. And for the first time in a decade, he felt truly, undeniably, unshakably alive. Life lesson: true strength is not born from comfort or luck, but from the willingness to confront your deepest fears, endure your greatest pain, and rise every time life challenges you. Discipline is not a chain. It is the sword that allows you to face the storm and stand unbroken.